Nam Le, Toyo Day. The year is 1879. The air in Black Willow, Wyoming, hung thick and heavy, smelling of dust and distant rain. A promise the bruised purple clouds on the horizon were eager to keep. Inside the Rusty Spur Saloon, the afternoon light was already fading, turning the smoky room a shade of old gold. Men hunched over cards and warm beer, their talk a low murmur that barely rose above the buzz of flies. Near the back, away from the boisterous laughter of the cattle hands, Nora Vale sat at a small, scarred table. Her sewing basket rested beside her, a tidy world of spools and needles that was the complete opposite of the room she found herself in. She was waiting for Hazel, the saloon's proprietor, to finish her shift so they could go over the mending Nora had done on the bar aprons. Nora was a woman of two worlds. By day, she was the town's librarian and seamstress, a figure of quiet order and meticulous stitches. Her fingers, though nimble with a needle, were just as comfortable turning the crisp pages of a book. But the library closed with the sun, and sometimes business, like the mending of aprons stained with beer and secrets, required her to step into places like the Rusty Spur. She kept her eyes down, focused on the worn grain of the table, tracing a knot in the wood with her gaze. She could feel the stares of the men, a mixture of curiosity and rough appraisal. But she had learned long ago to build a wall of polite indifference around herself. She was present, but not participating. The first clap of thunder rattled the windows in their frames. It wasn't a distant rumble. It was a sharp, angry crack directly overhead, as if God had snapped a giant whip. A collective grunt went through the saloon. Mugs were set down a little harder. Eyes flickered toward the swinging doors. The wind began to moan, a low, mournful sound that seeped through the cracks in the walls. Another minute, and the rain started. Not as a gentle patter, but as a sudden, violent assault, hammering against the tin roof with the sound of 1,000 tiny blacksmiths. Then came the flash. It wasn't just light, it was a silent, searing whiteness that bleached the world of all color for a split second. Every face in the saloon was illuminated in stark, ghostly detail, a man's mouth open mid-laugh, another's eyes wide with surprise. Nora flinched, her hands tightening on the wicker handle of her basket. The darkness that followed was absolute. It was a physical thing, a heavy, suffocating blanket thrown over the room. The lamps hadn't just flickered. They had been snuffed out in a single, collective gasp, a beat of stunned silence, and then chaos erupted. A chair scraped loudly as someone shot to their feet. A glass shattered. Voices rose, sharp with alarm. "What in blazes?" "The lamps, get the lamps." For Nora Vale, the sound and the sudden plunge into blackness were not just an inconvenience. They were a key turning a rusted lock in the deepest part of her mind. The low murmur of the saloon was gone, replaced by the roar of blood in her ears. She sat ramrod straight, her sewing basket clutched to her chest like a shield. The air, thick with the smell of stale beer and wet wool, suddenly felt thin, impossible to draw into her lungs. She was no longer in the Rusty Spur. She was somewhere else, somewhere cold and tight and utterly without light. The shouting of the men faded into a different sound, the groan of stressed timber, the terrifying trickle of loose rock, the muffled cries of her father calling her name from somewhere impossibly far away. The smell of dust was no longer the dry dust of a Wyoming street, but the damp, choking dust of the earth itself, the kind that filled your mouth and nose and lungs until you could taste your own grave. She was 17 again, trapped in the collapsed silver mine, the weight of a mountain pressing down on her. The lantern had been the first thing to go, its flame sputtering and dying, taking the last of her hope with it. "Hold the shutters!" someone yelled from the front of the saloon, the voice jarring her back to the present for a half-second. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the flagpole outside screamed as the metal rope slapped against it. A loose sheet of tin on the roof banged a frantic, irregular rhythm against the storm's fury. The sounds were real, here and now, but her mind twisted them, braided them with the echoes of the past. The banging tin became the sound of rock striking rock. Closer and closer. The shriek of the wind was the sound of the world tearing itself apart. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. Her hands, which could guide a needle through the finest linen with unshakable precision, began to tremble violently. She tried to tell herself to breathe, to remember she was in the saloon, that it was just a storm. But the panic was a physical force, a cold tide rising from her belly to her throat. The little pair of steel scissors in her basket, suddenly feeling heavy and dangerous, slipped from her trembling fingers. They hit the wooden floor with a clatter that sounded as loud as a gunshot in the disorienting dark. The sound broke her last thread of control. A small, choked sob escaped her lips. The saloon doors swung inward with a groan, admitting a rectangle of slightly less impenetrable gray light and the full force of the wind and rain. A figure stood silhouetted against the storm, broad-shouldered and solid. The man pushed the door shut behind him, plunging the room back into blackness. But his movements were steady, unhurried. He didn't stumble or call out. He just stood there for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. Eli Rourke had spent more nights under the stars than under a roof. He knew the different kinds of darkness, the soft, star-dusted dark of a clear prairie night, the murky dark of a forest, and the oppressive, ink-black dark of a storm like this one. His senses, honed by years of night watches and tracking by moonlight, were already working. He could smell the spilled beer, the wet sawdust, and something else, the sharp, metallic scent of fear. He heard the nervous shifting of men, their boots scuffing the floorboards. His hand went instinctively to the small oilskin pouch on his belt, his fingers searching for the familiar shape of a matchstick. His eyes, now accustomed to the gloom, began to pick out shapes. The long line of the bar, the bulk of the tables, the huddled forms of the patrons. And then he saw her. He hadn't known Nora Vale was there, but he recognized her posture even in the near-total blackness. She was sitting perfectly still, a statue of terror. While the room buzzed with frantic energy around her, he saw the faint outline of her form, rigid and tight. And he heard something no one else seemed to notice over the storm and the shouting, the tiny, hitched sound of her breathing. It was the sound of a cornered animal. He moved toward her, his steps quiet and sure on the creaking floorboards. He navigated between tables by memory and instinct. He heard the small clatter of her scissors on the floor just as he was approaching. He stopped beside her table, his shadow falling over her. Though in that darkness, a shadow had no meaning. Nora didn't see him. She was lost, drowning in the memory of the mine. Her world had shrunk to the pounding in her chest and the imagined weight of the earth above her. She felt a presence beside her and flinched, a small, involuntary jerk of her shoulders. Eli didn't speak right away. Words would be too loud, too jarring. Instead, he pulled the worn cotton bandana from his neck. It was clean, but carried the faint, honest scent of leather and open air. He reached down, his movements slow and deliberate, and gently placed the folded cloth over her hands, which were clenched white-knuckled on the handle of her sewing basket. Her first instinct was to pull away, but his touch was nothing more than the light pressure of the cloth. It wasn't a grab or a restraint. It was an offering. Then he leaned closer, his voice so low it was barely more than a breath against the storm's rage. "Take it, I'm here." The words were simple, direct. They weren't a question or a command. They were a statement of fact, a point of anchor in a spinning, lightless world. "Take it, I'm here." The English was plain, unadorned, but it cut through the fog of her panic. Her trembling fingers, acting on their own accord, curled hesitantly around the soft, dry fabric. It was real, solid, something to hold on to that wasn't born of memory and fear. She squeezed it, the texture of the worn cotton a surprising comfort against her slick palms. Outside, unseen by the panicked men in the saloon, a different kind of darkness was being orchestrated. Two figures, hunched against the driving rain, moved quickly down the muddy main street. They were Lyle Darrow's men. Rough hands paid for loyalty, not questions. Darrow, the owner of the mine that had almost claimed Nora's life and had taken her father's, owned most of the town. And what he didn't own, he knew fear was a better tool than a surveyor's map for acquiring land. With swift, practiced movements, the men worked at the street lamps, loosening the pins that held the glass casings, ensuring that when the time came, they would not light. They were not just dousing lights. They were manufacturing fear, one lamp at a time, letting the storm provide the perfect cover for their work. Inside the saloon, Eli kept his hand lightly over hers for another moment, the bandana a bridge between them. He could feel the frantic tremor in her fingers begin to subside, replaced by a deep, shuddering tension. He straightened up, his eyes scanning the room again. A man near the bar had finally managed to strike a match. The tiny flame sputtered, a fragile star in the immense darkness, before catching on the wick of a single lamp. A warm, yellow glow slowly pushed back the black, revealing frightened, relieved faces. Eli didn't wait for the room to return to its previous state. He knew Nora needed to be out of there, away from the crowd and the sudden, jarring return of light. He kept his voice low. "Let's go." She didn't answer, but she didn't resist when he gently guided her to her feet. She was still clutching the bandana, a lifeline. He bent down, his hand easily finding her fallen scissors on the floor, and tucked them securely into her basket. Then, with a firm but gentle hand on her elbow, he steered her through the throng of men now clustered around the newly lit lamp. He pushed the saloon doors open again, and they stepped out into the maelstrom. The wind tore at them, plastering Nora's dress to her legs and threatening to steal the hat from Eli's head. The street was a river of mud, the rain coming down in blinding sheets. The world was a symphony of gray and noise. Eli put himself between her and the worst of the wind, his larger frame acting as a shield. He guided her across the treacherous street, his boots sinking into the muck, his grip on her arm unwavering. The library was just across the way, dark and silent. He pushed open the door to the small building that served as both the town's collection of books and her own small living quarters in the back. The air inside was cool and smelled of paper, ink, and dried lavender. It was the smell of Nora's world, a world of peace and order. It was a stark contrast to the chaos they had just left. Eli didn't let go of her until they were safely inside and the door was closed, muting the storm's roar to a distant drumming. He didn't have a lamp, but he had come prepared for the storm. From a pouch on his saddle, he had retrieved a small, sturdy storm lantern. He set it on the main lending desk, the one Nora stood behind every day. He took out his matches again, the pouch protecting them from the damp. He struck one, the sulfur flaring to life, and carefully lit the lantern's wick. A steady, clean light filled the small room, pushing the shadows into the corners and glinting off the spines of the books that lined the walls. The light was contained, controlled. It wasn't the flickering, unpredictable light of the saloon lamps. It was a beacon. He looked at her. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and dark, but the frantic terror had receded, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. She was still holding his bandana, her knuckles white. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. He had brought her to safety. His part was done. Without another word, he turned and let himself out, the door clicking softly shut behind him, leaving her alone with the steady, golden light of the storm lantern on her desk. Nora stood frozen for a long time, listening to the rain on the roof. She slowly unfurled her fingers from the bandana. It was damp from her own sweat. She looked from the cloth in her hand to the lantern on the desk. Its light was a warm, living thing in the heart of the storm. The darkness was still out there, pressing against the windows, waiting, But it wasn't inside with her. Not anymore. A thought, fragile as a moth's wing, fluttered in her mind. No toi nua, nung no an ode, ko le min chiu noi. If it gets dark again. But if he's there, maybe I can bear it. She sank into her chair behind the desk, pulling the lantern a little closer. Its warmth a small shield against the long night ahead. The morning after the storm broke clean and sharp. The sky washed a pale, unassuming blue. Puddles the color of milky coffee stood in the ruts of the main street, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine. Black Willow was trying to piece itself back together. Men were already on roofs, hammering down loose tin sheets, their blows echoing in the quiet air. Nora Vale had been awake since the first hint of dawn, her mind too crowded for sleep. The storm lantern Eli had left her had burned steadily through the night, a small, golden sun in her back room. She had returned it to his saddle, left tethered outside the blacksmith's, before anyone else was stirring, along with the bandana, neatly folded. It was an exchange no one needed to see. She was sweeping the last of the tracked-in mud from the library's entrance when a shadow fell over the doorway. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. The scent of expensive cigar smoke and cheap cologne always preceded Lyle Darrow. He stood there, blocking the morning light. A large man made larger by his tailored coat and the sheer force of his presence. He had the kind of polished look that didn't belong in a dusty town like Black Willow, a look that always made things feel a little dirty in comparison. He took the cigar from his mouth, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was the expression a man used when looking at a piece of property he was about to acquire. "Morning, Miss Vale. Quite a blow we had." Nora's grip tightened on the broom handle. "Mr. Darrow." She kept her voice even. A flat, smooth stone against which his words could break. "I trust you weathered it all right," he continued, his eyes roving over the neat shelves of books, lingering for a moment on the clean floor. "Seems you keep a tidy place, tidy but unprofitable." He let the word hang in the air. He took a step inside, and the room seemed to shrink. "I was just reviewing the ledgers for my properties this morning. You know, with the new month approaching, it appears this establishment is a bit behind on its lease payments." Nora's back stiffened. "I paid the rent on the 1st of last month, as always." Darrow chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "Ah, but you're forgetting the ancillary fees, town upkeep, security, especially after a night like last night. We must all contribute to ensure our safety." He took another puff of his cigar, blowing the smoke out in a leisurely plume that filled the room with its cloying scent. "The ledger doesn't lie. You're 2 months in arrears. I'm a patient man, Miss Vale. But my patience has its limits. You have until the end of the week. Then you'll have to vacate." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The threat was as clean and sharp as a shard of glass. He was using the town's troubles he likely had a hand in creating, as a lever to pry her out. He turned to leave, pausing in the doorway. Such a shame. This town could use a good coal shed right here in the center of things. Much more practical than a library. Wouldn't you say? He gave her one last look, his eyes cold and flat. And then he was gone, the bright morning light rushing back in to fill the space he had occupied. For a long moment, Nora didn't move. She stood with the broom in her hand, her knuckles white. The air still tasted of his cigar. She methodically finished sweeping, hung the broom on its hook, and then walked to her desk. She pulled out the thick, leather-bound ledger where she kept her accounts. Her handwriting filled the pages. Neat and precise columns of income and expenses, the mending, the book lending, the occasional letter she wrote for those who could not. It was a meager living, but it was honest, and it was hers. She turned to the page for Darrow's property. There, at the bottom of the column for the previous month, was a new entry. It hadn't been there when she'd last checked. It was written in a different hand, a heavy, sloping script that looked angry on the page, in thick black ink. It read, Night Protection Services. The amount listed was exorbitant, precisely double her monthly rent. It was a phantom fee, a paper cudgel designed to beat her into submission. There was no signature, just the weight of the ink on the page, a stain on her careful accounting. The lie of it made her feel sick, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. It wasn't just about money, it was about the deliberate, calculated cruelty of it. He was trying to make her feel powerless, to make her believe that even the facts she wrote down with her own hand could be twisted and rewritten by his. Later that afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, the library door creaked open. This time, it was Eli Rourke. He didn't fill the room the way Darrow had. He seemed to fit into it, his quiet presence a complement to the silence of the books, not a violation of it. He was carrying a new saddle he'd just picked up from the smithy, the leather smelling rich and earthy. He set it down just inside the door, his movements economical and sure. He nodded toward her front door. Heard the latch was shaken loose in the storm. I can fix it. Reinforce the frame, too. His gaze was practical, taking in the state of the door, the windows, the world-weary look of the building. Nora looked up from her ledger, the damning entries still burning in her vision. She managed a small, tired shake of her head. It's not the door I'm worried about, Eli. It's the lamps. The words came out quieter than she intended. Someone is putting them out, on purpose. When night comes, I can't stay here alone if there's no light. Eli didn't look at her. Instead, his eyes went to the small oil lamp sitting on her desk, the one she'd used for reading after dusk. Its glass chimney was clean, the wick neatly trimmed. He studied it for a moment, his expression unreadable. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and steady, a counterpoint to the nervous energy humming inside her. Darkness doesn't have teeth, bad men do. Darkness doesn't have teeth, bad men do. The simple truth of it hit her with the force of a physical blow. He understood. He wasn't dismissing her fear as a simple phobia of the dark. He saw the hand that was snuffing out the lights. He knew the fear was not of the shadow, but of the man who cast it. His gaze finally met hers, and in his eyes, she saw not pity, but a quiet, grim understanding. It was a shared acknowledgement of the real danger, and it was more comforting than 100 empty reassurances. The whispers had already started slithering through Black Willow, passed over saloon bars and dry goods counters. Hazel, wiping down a glass at the rusty spur, had mentioned it to the blacksmith. The blacksmith's wife had told the baker's boy, while delivering bread, had said it to Nora. Darrow wanted her land. He was planning to tear down the library, the last public space in town that wasn't owned or controlled by him, and build a storage shed for the coal from his mine. The library stood on a prime piece of property, right on the main square. It was an affront to him that something so unprofitable, so dedicated to the quiet pursuit of knowledge, should occupy such valuable real estate. The rumors gave his actions a cold, hard logic. He wasn't just being cruel, he was being strategic. He was choking the town, and her little library was in the way of his fist. Even Reverend Miller, a man whose faith was usually as solid and unyielding as the church steeple, seemed shaken. He stopped by later that day, his face etched with worry. He was a good man, but a cautious one, a shepherd who feared the wolf more than he trusted his flock. He sat across from Nora at her small reading table, his hands clasped nervously. "Nora, my child," he began, his voice gentle. "I've heard things, Mr. Darrow. He is not a man to be trifled with. This town is becoming a difficult place for decent folk. Perhaps it would be wise to consider leaving. There are other towns, bigger towns, where a woman of your skills would be most welcome." Nora listened, her hands resting on the open ledger. She heard the kindness in his voice, but beneath it, she heard the counsel of fear. "Leave, run, let the darkness win." She said nothing. She simply looked at him, her gaze steady. The fear was still there. A cold snake coiled in her gut, but something else was hardening around it. Resolve, defiance. She would not be scared out of her home, out of the only place she had ever managed to carve out a sliver of peace for herself. The Reverend saw the answer in her silence, in the sudden, flinty look in her eyes. He sighed, patted her hand, and left, leaving behind the scent of old paper and quiet surrender. As the afternoon light softened, the children started to arrive. 4 of them, the Miller twins and the baker's 2 youngest, clutching slate boards and chalk. It was the part of her day Nora cherished most, in their bright, curious faces. The town's troubles seemed to fade away. She was their teacher, their guide into the world of letters. Today, she stood before them at the large blackboard. She picked up a piece of chalk, and her hand, to her immense frustration, had a slight but noticeable tremor. The memory of the night before, of Darrow's visit, was still thrumming through her nerves. She took a slow, deep breath, curled her fingers more tightly around the chalk, and wrote a single word in careful, block letters. Light. This is the word for today, she said, her voice clearer than she felt. Light. It means the sun. It means the flame in a lamp. It is the opposite of darkness. The children dutifully copied the letters onto their slates, their tongues sticking out in concentration. The scratching of their chalk was the only sound in the room. Nora watched them, a fierce, protective feeling rising in her chest. Darrow could threaten her. He could try to intimidate the whole town, but he would not take this from them. He would not extinguish this small flame. Teaching them to write the word alight felt like an act of rebellion. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Eli Rourke was making a decision. He wasn't a man who involved himself in town politics or the affairs of others. He kept to himself, earning his keep by breaking horses and taking on odd jobs that required a strong back and a steady hand. But he had seen the look in Nora's eyes. He had felt the tremor in her hands when he'd covered them with his bandana. And he had seen Darrow leave the library that morning, a smug look on his face. He found Jedediah Kane, the foreman for the Shadow Bend Ranch, down at the stables. Shadow Bend's grazing lands bordered the town to the west, a sprawling property that ran right up to the foothills. "Jed," Eli said, his tone casual. "I hear you're looking for another night rider to watch the herd." The foreman spat a stream of tobacco juice. "Always. Coyotes have been getting bold." He eyed Eli. "It's long. Cold work. Don't pay much." "The pay is fine," Eli said. "I'll take it." The job meant he would be on horseback all night, every night. It meant circling the vast, dark pastures that overlooked Black Willow. From the western ridge of Shadow Bend's property, you could see the entire town laid out below, a small collection of flickering lights against an endless black prairie. From there, a man could see if a street lamp went out when it shouldn't. He could see if shadows were moving where they didn't belong. He would be close enough to help. He said none of this to Jedediah. He just nodded, shook the foreman's hand, and walked away to ready his horse for a long night's work. The past was not another country. For Nora Vale, it was the room next door. She could stand in the sunlit library, surrounded by the quiet, orderly world she had built, and with a single misplaced sound or a sudden shadow, the door would swing open and she would be back inside it. The memory was not a story she told herself. It was a physical place, waiting patiently for her. She was 17. The air was thick with the smell of wet rock and the metallic tang of silver ore. It was a special treat, a chance to bring her father his dinner and see where he worked his long night shifts. She had been proud, walking beside him into the mouth of the earth, his lantern swinging between them, casting their shadows long and dancing on the tunnel walls. He was a good man, her father, with calloused hands and a quiet laugh that made the dark seem less menacing. He'd found a particularly rich vein, and he wanted to show her just a few more months of this. "Nora girl," he'd said, his voice echoing slightly. "And we'll have enough to buy that little plot of land with the creek running through it." The first sound was a groan, deep in the bones of the mountain, a sound of immense pressure finding a point of weakness. Her father had frozen, his head cocked, listening. A fine dust, dislodged from the ceiling, rained down on them, glittering in the lamplight. "Just the mountain settling," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. He told her to stay put while he went to check the supports just ahead, around a bend in the tunnel. Then came the second sound. It was not a groan, but a splintering crack, sharp and violent, followed by a deafening roar that was both sound and vibration. The ground beneath her feet bucked. The lantern her father had left with her fell, its glass shattering, the flame hissing and dying in an instant. The darkness was a punch to the face, total and absolute. The roar went on, a cascade of rock and earth, and then a terrible, final silence, broken only by the sound of her own screaming. She had screamed his name until her throat was raw. For a while, she thought she could hear him calling back, his voice muffled and distant. But soon, that too was gone. He never came back up into the light. The company that owned the mine, Lyle Darrow's first major enterprise, had called it a tragic, unavoidable accident. They had spent 3 days searching before declaring the tunnel permanently unsafe and sealing it with timber and rock. They had sealed her father inside. From that day forward, darkness was not an absence of light. It was a presence, a living, breathing enemy that smelled of damp earth and tasted of stone dust. It had weight and texture and a voice that whispered of suffocation. So, every night of her life since, Nora slept with a lamp burning low on her bedside table. The small, steady flame was a guardian, a sentry standing watch against the memories. And in the small, hidden pocket of every dress she owned, there was a small, flat box. Inside, wooden matchsticks lay in a neat row. She ran her fingers over the box countless times a day, a subconscious, reassuring gesture. It was a promise to herself she would never be without the means to make light. In the library, this constant low-level vigilance was her shadow, a bank of clouds passing over the sun. Plunging the room into momentary gloom was enough to make her stop, her hand frozen over a book, her breath held tight in her chest. She would count the seconds until the sun returned. 1, 2, 3, 4, breathe. The flicker of a candle as it burned low, its flame dancing and threatening to die, could make her heart hammer against her ribs. She would immediately get up and light a new one, her movements quick and jerky. The fear was a quiet madness, a secret she carried inside the fortress of her neat, orderly life. Eli Rourke had started to notice. He never said anything, never drew attention to it, but he saw the way her eyes darted to the windows when the sky darkened, the way her shoulders tensed when a patron's entry cast a sudden shadow across the floor. He had learned, without being told, to make his presence known gently. He wouldn't just walk in. He would stop at the threshold, and when he reached the main desk, he would rap his knuckles on the worn wood 3 times. Knock, knock, knock. It was a simple, quiet sound. It wasn't a greeting. It was a signal. "It's me. I'm here. You are safe." The first time he'd done it, she had visibly relaxed, a deep, shuddering breath escaping her. Now, she waited for it. That small, 3-beat rhythm was a new kind of anchor, a sound that said the door to the past could remain closed, at least for a little while. But Lyle Darrow was intent on prying that door open, not just for Nora, but for the whole town. His Phantom Night Protection Services fee was only the beginning. A few days after his visit to the library, a new service was announced. Men. Darrow's men would now patrol the town at night, for a modest fee. They would ensure the street lamps remained lit. They would offer peace of mind. It was a classic protection racket, as blatant as it was effective. He was selling a cure for a disease he was creating. Fear began to settle over Black Willow like the fine dust from the mine. People started paying. A few dollars to keep the light burning outside their homes felt like a small price to pay for a night without worry. But with each payment, the town yielded a little more of itself to Darrow. He was making them complicit in their own intimidation. He was teaching them to be afraid of the dark, and then charging them for the lesson. One evening, just as Nora was preparing to close the library, Hazel from the Rusty Spur slipped in. The saloon owner was a practical, no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She leaned over the counter, her voice a conspiratorial whisper that smelled faintly of whiskey and wood smoke. "Nora, you need to be careful," she said, her eyes scanning the empty street outside. "I heard some of Darrow's boys talking. Bragging, more like they're planning something for tonight. They're not just going to let the lamps burn out from neglect anymore. They're going to douse them. A whole section of the town. Your section." The cold knot in Nora's stomach tightened. It wasn't just a threat against her anymore. It was a siege. He was going to isolate her, surround her with a moat of manufactured darkness. She could feel the walls of the mine closing in, the air growing thin. Hazel placed a hand on her arm. "You shouldn't stay here alone tonight. Come over to the saloon. You'll be safe with us." Nora appreciated the offer. She truly did. But the thought of running, of hiding in the noisy, crowded saloon, felt like a surrender. It would mean he had won. It would mean letting the 17-year-old girl in the dark make the decisions for the woman she was now. She looked around her library, at the silent, waiting books. They were full of stories of courage, of people who stood against dragons and tyrants. She had spent her life among these stories. It was time to write one of her own. "Thank you, Hazel," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But this is my home. I'm not leaving it." After Hazel left, Nora stood at her desk for a long time. The fear was there, a cold and familiar companion, but fighting against it was a spark of anger, hot and clean. He would not turn her home into a tomb. He would not make her a prisoner of his manufactured night. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, a bottle of her best ink, and her finest pen. Her hand was steady. The tremor was gone, burned away by the heat of her resolve. In neat, clear script, she wrote, "Community reading night." Below it, she added, "The night is long, but our lights are many. Do not stay home in the dark. Come to the library this evening after sundown. Bring a lantern. Bring a story. We will share our light and wait for the dawn together. All are welcome." She made half a dozen copies, the pen scratching a determined rhythm against the silence. She then took the flyers and a pot of paste and walked out into the falling dusk. She tacked one to the door of the library. She put another on the community notice board by the general store. She left one on the door of the church. It was a small act, a paper and ink defiance. But it was a beginning. She was not just inviting people to the library, she was inviting them to be brave with her. Across town, Eli Rourke was also preparing for the night. Since taking the job at Shadow Bend, he had spent his nights on the ridge, a silent guardian angel on horseback. He had watched the lights of Black Willow, noting which ones flickered, which ones died too soon. He knew what was happening, and after seeing Nora's small, defiant flyer on the notice board, he knew tonight would be different. He sat on a crate outside the blacksmith's shop, the air growing cool around him. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity. In one hand, he held his hunting knife. In the other, a sharpening stone. He drew the blade across the stone in long, smooth strokes. The rhythmic shy-ink. Shy-ink, shy-ink of steel on stone, a kind of meditation. He wasn't sharpening it for a fight. Not necessarily. He was sharpening it for whatever the night might bring. A prepared man had more options than an unprepared one. When the blade had an edge so fine he could shave the hair on his arm with it, he put the knife away. He turned his attention to his storm lantern, the same one he had left with Nora. It was a good, solid piece of equipment, built to withstand wind and rain, but he could make it better. He took a long, supple strip of leather and began to work it, braiding it into a sturdy thong. He carefully, securely, tied the thong to the lantern's wire handle. Now, it could be hung from his saddle horn or looped over his wrist, leaving his hands free. It was no longer just a lamp. It was a tool, adapted for a long and difficult night. He checked the oil. It was full. He trimmed the wick. He was ready. He swung up into his saddle, the lantern giving a soft clink against the pommel. He didn't ride toward the open range tonight. He rode toward the ridge that overlooked the town, a dark rider moving toward a gathering darkness, ready to stand watch over one small, brave light. The first to arrive were the Miller twins, their faces scrubbed clean, each solemnly carrying a small tin lantern as if it were a holy relic. Then came the baker and his wife with their children, a warm, boisterous group that smelled of flour and yeast, their large family lantern casting a glow that seemed as wholesome as fresh bread. Hazel from the saloon arrived alone, but she brought a massive brass lamp from the Rusty Spur's main table, its polished surface reflecting the faces of those already gathered. One by one, in pairs, as families, they came. The blacksmith, the general store owner, the quiet ranch hands who were in town for supplies. They trickled into the library, each bringing their own small bubble of light, until the room was filled with a soft, patchwork quilt of illumination. They set their lanterns on shelves, on tables, on the floor in safe corners. One large storm lantern, belonging to the blacksmith, was hung from a central ceiling beam, its powerful, steady beam casting a wide circle of security over the entire room. The combined light from 24 lamps pushed the night back from the windows, creating a warm, golden haven in the heart of Black Willow. The air grew thick with the smell of warm oil and the quiet hum of community. They arranged themselves in a loose circle, the adults on chairs and crates, the children on a large rug in the center. The fear that had been stalking the town's streets had no place in this room. Here, it was kept at bay by glass and wick and the simple courage of showing up. At Nora's gentle prompting, the youngest of the baker's sons, a boy named Samuel with a missing front tooth and a voice as clear as a bell, began to read. He stood in the center of the circle, his small shoulders squared, holding a worn copy of Grimm's fairy tales. He read the story of Hansel and Gretel, his small finger tracing the words on the page. His innocent voice filled the room, telling a tale of children lost in a dark wood. And for a moment, everyone in the room was a child again, listening with rapt attention, knowing that even in the scariest stories, there was always the hope of finding the way home. When he finished to a round of soft applause, it was Nora's turn. She didn't read from a book. The story she told was one she had crafted in her mind in the hours leading up to this evening. A story for them, for this specific night. She remained seated, her hands clasped loosely in her lap, the light from a nearby lantern softening the tired lines around her eyes. Once, she began, her voice a little hesitant at first, there was a man who was not afraid of the dark. The people in his village thought him strange. While they barred their doors and shuttered their windows at dusk, he would walk the forest paths and the empty fields. They asked him, "How can you walk when you cannot see?" And he would answer, "I am looking for something." As she spoke, a change came over her. The initial tremor in her voice smoothed out, replaced by a quiet, compelling warmth. She was no longer just a librarian. She was a storyteller, weaving a spell of words. The villagers were afraid of many things in the dark, she continued, her gaze moving around the circle, meeting the eyes of her neighbors. They were afraid of beasts with sharp teeth and of spirits that moaned in the wind. But most of all, they were afraid of getting lost, of the darkness swallowing them whole. But the night walker, as they called him, kept walking. One night, a little girl, braver than the rest, followed him to the edge of the village. She called out, "What are you looking for that is so important you must search for it in the night?" The man stopped and turned. The girl could not see his face, only his shape against the stars. He said, "I am looking for the dawn." and I have found that if you walk toward it all night, you are the very first one to see it. The darkness is long, but it is not endless. It always breaks." Nora's voice grew stronger, filled with a conviction that was as real and tangible as the light in the room. The man told the girl that he carried his own light, not in a lantern, but in his heart. It was the memory of every sunrise he had ever seen, and that memory was enough to guide him through any darkness. She finished her story, and a deep, appreciative silence settled over the room. The simple parable hung in the air, understood by all. They were not just waiting out a long night, they were walking toward the dawn. It was in that moment of shared, quiet strength that the library door crashed open. It didn't just open, it was kicked in, the wood of the frame splintering with a sound like a gunshot. The door slammed against the interior wall, and a sudden, violent gust of wind tore through the room. Lanterns flickered wildly, their flames dancing like terrified sprites. Shadows leaped and writhed on the walls. A collective gasp went through the crowd. 2 men stood silhouetted in the doorway, blocking the exit. They were big, rough shapes, their faces obscured by the brims of their hats. The one in front took a step into the room, and the smell of cheap, sour whiskey rolled in with him, a foul miasma that polluted the warm air. He swayed slightly, a cruel grin splitting his shadowy face. "Well, look what we got here," he sneered, his voice a gravelly slur. "A little party. The boss don't like parties he ain't invited to." He took another unsteady step forward. "He said to tell you folks something." He paused for dramatic effect, his eyes sweeping over the frightened faces illuminated in the flickering light. "Lights out tonight." What happened next was a blur of brutal, efficient destruction. The men moved with a practiced speed that belied their drunken swagger. The first man lunged for the large lantern hanging from the ceiling beam, grabbing it and smashing it against the floor. Glass exploded, and oil splashed across the wooden planks. The second man moved along the wall, his hands darting out, pulling the wicks from the smaller lamps, tipping them over, snuffing out their flames with contemptuous speed. Light after light vanished. A woman screamed, a sharp, ragged sound that was quickly cut off. A child began to cry, a high, panicked wail. The room plunged from a warm, golden haven into a chaotic, terrifying twilight. And then, as the last lamp was extinguished, into a thick, disorienting blackness. The only light remaining was the faint, dying orange glow from the embers in the small stone fireplace at the far end of the room. The darkness was absolute, filled with the sounds of shuffling feet, panicked breathing, and the sharp, acrid smell of spilled lamp oil. Someone stumbled and fell with a heavy thud. "Stay down." Eli Rourke's voice cut through the chaos like a whip. He hadn't been sitting in the circle. He had been standing near the back, by the fireplace, a silent observer. His voice was not a plea, it was a command, sharp and clear and full of an authority that instantly silenced the rising panic. "Stay down and stay quiet." Nora was on the floor. In the first moment of confusion, she had been knocked from her chair. The sudden, violent plunge into blackness was a physical blow. The smell of the spilled oil, the screams, the feeling of being trapped in a crowded, dark space. It was the mine. The door in her mind blew off its hinges, and the memory flooded in, cold and suffocating. She could feel the pressure in her ears, taste the stone dust in her throat. Her breath hitched, her lungs refusing to draw air. Panic, cold and sharp, sank its claws into her. But through the roaring in her ears, she heard Eli's voice. Not his shout to the room, but his quiet words from the day before, replaying in her mind as clearly as if he were whispering in her ear. "Bong toi kong ko rang, ngui sao moi ko." Darkness doesn't have teeth. Bad men do. The thought was a lifeline. The men were the danger, not the dark. The dark was just empty. She was on her hands and knees, her dress torn, her palms flat against the rough wood of the floorboards. She had to move. She couldn't stay frozen. She began to crawl, her hands reaching out in front of her, trying to find a landmark in the lightless world. Her fingers brushed against the solid, familiar wood of a bookshelf. She anchored herself to it, her cheek pressed against the cool spines of the books. It was real. It was her library. It was not the mine. Eli was already moving. He knew the smell of spilled oil was the prelude to the smell of smoke, and smoke in a crowded, dark room was a death sentence. He grabbed the heavy wool blanket from the reading nook, dipped it into the water bucket kept by the hearth, and yelled again, his voice directed toward the door. "Get out now!" He was creating a diversion, giving the two thugs a clear path to leave, hoping to de-escalate the situation before it turned truly deadly. He heard their heavy, stumbling footsteps and the slam of the splintered door. They were gone, but the danger they had created remained. A thin, choking smoke was already beginning to fill the room from the spilled oil nearing the hot embers. People were starting to cough. Eli, holding the wet blanket, began to move toward the center of the room, ready to smother any flames, but in the pitch black, he was moving blind. He fumbled for the fireplace, for the embers, for any source of light to guide him. Nora, still pressed against the bookshelf, heard the coughing. She smelled the smoke. The image of the single, dying lantern in the mine flashed in her mind. But this time, the memory didn't paralyze her. It spurred her. She knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, what she had to do. The embers in the hearth were the only hope they had. She remembered something else Eli had done. His signal. The 3 quiet knocks on her desk. A rhythm of safety. A count to control the fear. She closed her eyes. It was a strange thing to do in a room already devoid of light. But she was not trying to see with her eyes. She was trying to silence the panic. To find her way by memory and instinct alone. She took a breath. Then another. She let the sounds of the room, the frightened whispers, the coughing, the shuffling feet fade away, until all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart. Bong toi kongko rang. She pushed off from the bookshelf, crawling toward the faint, residual warmth of the fireplace. Her hand brushed against something soft, the baker's wife's skirt. She heard a small whimper. "It's all right," Nora whispered, the words a promise to both the woman and herself. "It's all right." She reached the stone hearth. It was rough and cool under her palms. The warmth from the embers was stronger now. A faint beacon. She could hear Eli nearby, his low voice murmuring reassurances to the children. She took one last, deep breath. She began her count, a silent rhythm in her mind. 1. She pictured the layout of the hearth. 2. She remembered where the small pile of kindling was kept. 3. She reached forward, her hand plunging into the dusty, ashy warmth of the fireplace. Her fingers brushed against the glowing embers, a brief, sharp sting of heat, and then they closed around a thin, dry piece of cedar kindling. She pulled it back, a tiny, glowing red tip, like the eye of a sleeping dragon, winked at her in the blackness. She held it steady, her hand surprisingly firm, and blew on it. Once, twice. A small spark jumped. A tiny, hesitant flame flickered to life, casting a weak, dancing light on her own determined face. She carefully touched the flame to the larger pile of kindling and paper waiting in the hearth. The fire caught with a soft whoosh. Flames erupted, bright and brilliant, orange and gold, roaring up the chimney. Light flooded the room. It was a sudden, dramatic, life-giving explosion of brightness. In that instant, everyone saw everyone else. The room was a tableau of the chaos. The Miller twins, huddled together under a table, their faces streaked with tears. The baker, shielding his children with his own body. Hazel, her face a mask of grim fury. And Eli, halfway across the room with the wet blanket in his hands, his head turning toward the sudden light, his face a mixture of shock and profound relief. The thick, oily smoke was now visible, a roiling gray cloud near the ceiling. But the immediate danger of the darkness was over. The fire in the hearth was a defiant, roaring beast, consuming the shadows and holding the night at bay. Nora slowly, unsteadily, got to her feet. Her dress was smudged with ash. Her hair had come loose from its pins, and there was a small red mark on her hand where the ember had touched her. She stood in the warm, flickering light of the fire she had created, and her gaze sought out Eli's across the smoky room. He looked at her, his eyes locking with hers. He saw not the frightened, trembling woman from the saloon, but someone new, someone forged in the crucible of that terrifying moment. And for the first time in 10 years, Nora Vale looked into the deep, dancing shadows in the corners of a room, and her eyes did not flinch. She did not look away. She had walked through the dark, and she had made her own light. After the last of the townsfolk had departed, their frightened whispers and expressions of gratitude fading into the night, a heavy silence settled over the ravaged library. It was a silence thick with the smell of smoke, spilled oil, and charred wood. The fire in the hearth still crackled, its light casting long, dancing shadows that made the overturned tables and scattered books look like the wreckage of a battlefield. Nora moved through the room with a methodical calm, picking up a fallen book, righting a toppled chair. The adrenaline that had fueled her courage was gone, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary ache. But the fear had not returned. In its place was a cold, clear anger. Eli stood by the pool of spilled oil near the center of the room, the mess glinting in the firelight. The wet blanket he'd used to keep the flames from spreading lay in a sodden heap nearby. He crouched down, his movements economical and precise. He didn't touch the oil with his bare hand. Instead, he took out his bandana, not the one he had given her, but a fresh one from his pocket, and dipped a corner into the viscous liquid. He brought it slowly to his nose. His eyes narrowed in concentration. He sniffed once, then again, his expression hardening. Nora stopped what she was doing, watching him. "What is it?" He stood up, his gaze distant, as if he were smelling a memory. "This isn't lamp oil," he said, his voice low and certain. "Kerosene is thin, burns clean. This—" He rubbed the oily fabric between his thumb and forefinger. "This is heavy, greasy. It smells of sulfur." He looked at her, his eyes grim. "It's coal oil, the kind they use for lubricating heavy machinery at the mine. It comes from Darrow's warehouse." The words hung in the air. A key turning a lock. It wasn't just a random act of vandalism with whatever oil the thugs could find. It was specific. It was a signature. Nora's mind began to move, connecting disparate pieces of information with a sudden, startling clarity. The mine, Darrow. The library's history was intertwined with the town's, and the town's history was carved out of the earth by Darrow's enterprises. She walked decisively to the tall oak filing cabinet in the corner, the one that held the town archives and property records from before Darrow owned nearly everything. Her fingers, stained with a bit of soot, moved quickly through the files. She was looking for something she hadn't thought about in years, a relic from the town's founding. She pulled out a large, rolled-up sheet of canvas-backed paper, yellowed with age. She spread it out on the one table that remained upright. It was a surveyor's map of Black Willow, drawn 20 years prior, when the silver mine was still the town's lifeblood. The ink was faded, the lines precise and technical, and on it, rendered in a thin, dotted blue line, was something most of the current residents had forgotten or never knew existed. "An old pipeline," she whispered, her finger tracing the line. "They laid it before the railroad spur was built. It was for the original mining operation. It carried oil from a storage facility down by the river directly to the mine to run the first steam pumps." Eli leaned over the map, his shadow falling across the old drawing. Her fingers stopped, tapping the paper. The blue line began at a square marked Riverside Storage Depot and ended at the mine entrance on the edge of town. But its path ran directly underneath the main square, passing not 20 feet from the library's foundation. Darrow's main warehouse now stood on the exact spot marked as the Riverside Storage Depot. "He's using the town's own history against us," Nora said, a quiet fury in her voice. Without another word, Eli walked to the splintered doorway and looked out into the darkness. The street was empty, but the mud held a story. He lit his own storm lantern, the one with the leather thong, and held it low to the ground. "Come here," he said softly. Nora joined him, and he pointed. There, in the damp earth, were the tracks, 2 sets of them, their outlines clear and deep. They were the heavy, blocky prints of work boots, not cowboy boots. And in the ridges of the soles, mixed with the dark mud, was something else. A fine, black powder that caught the lantern light with a dull, gritty sheen. Coal dust. They followed the tracks. It was a slow, silent procession. Eli held the lantern low, his eyes fixed on the ground, while Nora walked beside him, her gaze scanning the darkened storefronts. The trail was easy to follow. It led away from the library, across the deserted town square where the street lamps stood like sightless sentinels. And then it turned, heading straight for the dark, hulking shape of the Riverside warehouse. The boot prints and the damning black dust they carried led directly to Lyle Darrow's front door. They stopped 100 feet away, concealed in the shadows of the blacksmith's shop. The evidence was clear. A muddy, grimy line connecting the crime to its source. They were turning to go back when a figure emerged from the side door of the rusty spur. It was Hazel, a heavy shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the night chill. She saw their lantern and hurried over, her face a mask of worry and anger. "Are you two all right?" she asked in a hushed, urgent tone. "I saw those animals run off. I was about to come check on you." "We're fine," Nora said, her voice steady. "They're gone." "They're Darrow's," Hazel spat, her voice laced with contempt. "I've seen them before, collecting his fees. But listen." She drew closer, lowering her voice even more. "I was watching from my upstairs window. It's not just that they doused the lamps, it's witch lamps. They didn't touch the ones on the far side of town, near the livery. They only hit this block, the general store, the street in front of the church. And here, they're cutting you off. Nora, they're drawing a circle of darkness right around this library." The pressure Hazel described was a physical thing. Nora could feel it, the invisible walls closing in. After Hazel had wished them good night and scurried back to the safety of her saloon, Nora and Eli returned to the library. The fire had died down to a bed of glowing coals, and the room was growing cold. Nora took out a fresh sheet of paper and a piece of charcoal from the hearth. With quick, precise strokes, she began to sketch a map of the town from memory. It wasn't a surveyor's map like the old one. It was a map of fear. She drew the library in the center. Then, with a heavy, dark line, she marked the section of town Hazel had described, the area where the lights had gone out. The shape she drew was a crude semicircle, a noose tightening around the square. Each extinguished lamp was another point of pressure, another step in a deliberate campaign to isolate and terrorize her until she broke and abandoned the land Darrow coveted. While she worked, Eli had slipped back out into the night, his lantern a lone firefly moving through the darkness. He was gone for nearly half an hour. When he returned, he was carrying something in his hand. He didn't say a word, just walked over to the table where Nora was finishing her grim map and set the objects down. The first was a wick puller, a slender metal tool with a small hook at the end, designed for pulling new wicks through the narrow channels of an oil lamp. It was a specialized tool, not something one would find in an average home. The second was a small, tightly woven canvas bag, no bigger than a man's fist. It was stained dark and reeked of the same heavy, sulfurous coal oil that was spilled on her floor. "Found them under the wooden bridge that crosses the creek," he said quietly. "Tucked up on a support beam. They plan to retrieve them later, I reckon. Nora looked from the tool to the bag, then to her charcoal map, and finally to the old surveyor's map with its forgotten blue line. All the pieces were there, laid out in the dying light of the fire. It was no longer a mystery. It was a conspiracy. Darrow wasn't just intimidating her. He was waging a quiet, insidious war against the entire town. He created the fear of the dark, and then he sold them the protection from it, all while systematically isolating the one person who stood in the way of his ultimate prize. The pieces clicked into place with the cold, hard finality of a jail cell door slamming shut. She looked at Eli, his face carved by shadows and firelight. He had not offered empty words of comfort. He had not told her to run. He had listened. He had observed. And he had brought her the truth, piece by incriminating piece. He had trusted her to be strong enough to face it. A new kind of resolve settled over her, displacing the last vestiges of fear. It was as solid and real as the stone hearth. "We expose him on Sunday, in front of the whole town," she said, her voice low but carrying the clear, ringing tone of conviction. "We expose him on Sunday, in front of the whole town." Sunday morning was when everyone gathered at the church, which also served as the town hall for any serious matters. It was the one time the entire community was together, a captive audience. It was the only place their words might stand a chance against Darrow's power. Eli looked at the evidence on the table, then at her face. He saw no hesitation there, only a stark, unwavering determination. He gave a single, slow nod. "All right, but tonight will be dark. Very dark." "All right," he said, "but tonight will be dark. Very dark." He wasn't just talking about the sky. They had kicked the hornet's nest. Darrow's men had failed. And now, until the sun rose on Sunday morning, they were completely, utterly on their own. The darkness outside the library's splintered door was no longer just an absence of light. It was the hunting ground of a wounded and angry animal. The hours after midnight bled into one another, each one darker and colder than the last. From a vantage point in the deep shadows across from Darrow's warehouse, Eli and Nora kept their vigil. They sat on upturned crates behind the blacksmith's forge, the single storm lantern resting on the ground between them. Its wick turned down so low the flame was a mere thumbnail of gold, a secret they held against the oppressive dark. Eli's horse, Shadow, stood nearby, patient and silent as a statue. The town was a ghost of itself, every window black, every door barred. The only sounds were the wind whistling through the eaves and the distant, mournful cry of a coyote. Nora was not afraid. The fear was a familiar landscape, but she was no longer lost in it. She was walking through it, with a guide and with a purpose. She was keenly aware of Eli beside her, a solid, reassuring presence in the gloom. He wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the warehouse, his focus absolute. He was a man built for waiting, for the long, quiet hours of the night watch. Just as the cold was beginning to seep deep into her bones, a sliver of yellow light appeared under the warehouse's side door. It vanished as quickly as it came. A moment later, the door creaked open. 3 figures slipped out, moving with a furtive haste that spoke of guilt. They were the men from the library, their shapes recognizable even in the deep shadow. One of them, the leader who had sneered at them, was carrying a heavy leather satchel. They didn't head toward the town. They moved in the opposite direction, toward the rough, broken country that began where Black Willow ended. Eli was on his feet in an instant, his movements fluid and silent. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice a low rumble. "No," Nora said, her voice equally quiet but unyielding. She stood up, pulling her shawl tighter. "They dropped something at the library. They might have more. I need to see." He looked at her for a half-second, and in the faint lantern glow, he saw the steel in her eyes. It was not a plea, it was a statement. He gave a single, sharp nod. He doused the lantern, plunging them into total blackness for a moment before cupping his hand around the chimney and blowing gently on the wick, bringing a tiny bead of flame back to life. He handed it to her. "Keep it shielded and hold on tight." He swung up onto Shadow's back and reached down for her. She put her foot in the stirrup he offered, and he pulled her up, settling her in front of him on the saddle. It was a close fit, her back pressed against his chest, her hands occupied with keeping the precious lantern steady and shielded from the wind. Shadow moved off, his hooves making almost no sound in the soft dirt at the edge of the road. They followed the three men at a distance, the single tiny point of their lantern's light a fragile secret in the vast darkness. The men were on foot, moving quickly toward the dark maw of Ash Fork Canyon, a narrow, winding gorge carved by centuries of spring floods. It was a known shortcut to the old mining camps in the hills, but a treacherous one, especially at night. As they reached the canyon's entrance, the men lit a lantern of their own, its broader, brighter beam suddenly illuminating the path ahead of them. They were getting careless, confident they were not being followed. This was their mistake. Eli reined Shadow in, letting them get further ahead before he urged the horse into the canyon's narrow throat. The world changed instantly. The open sky vanished, replaced by towering walls of dark rock that seemed to lean in over them. The air grew damp and cold, carrying the sound of dripping water, each drop echoing in the tight space. The ground underfoot was no longer dirt but slick, uneven stone. Shadow's iron-shod hooves, which had been silent on the road, now struck the rock with sharp, ringing clicks. Sparks flew. A hoof slipped on a patch of wet moss, and the horse grunted. Finding its footing with a clatter of iron on stone, Nora instinctively leaned with the animal, her knuckles white as she clutched the lantern. The small flame inside jumped and danced, a frantic, trapped thing. She pressed it against her body, her shawl and her arm forming a shield against the drafts that swirled through the canyon. They rounded a sharp bend and saw the men's lantern 100 yards ahead, its light bobbing and weaving as they navigated the difficult terrain. The canyon narrowed even further, becoming little more than a tight, winding corridor. Eli urged Shadow into a slow, careful trot, the clicks of his hooves a staccato rhythm against the steady drip, drip, drip of water from the rock walls. Suddenly, the light ahead of them stopped moving. A man's voice, sharp with alarm, echoed back to them. "Did you hear that?" They had been spotted. The leader of the group spun around, his face a pale oval in his own lantern light. His eyes widened when he saw the lone rider with a second person, a dark shape emerging from the gloom. For a moment, he was frozen with surprise. Then, his surprise curdled into panicked rage. "It's the cowboy!" he yelled, his voice unnaturally loud in the enclosed space. "Get him!" He did something then that was born of pure, desperate malice. He opened the satchel, pulled out one of the heavy canvas bags of coal oil, and hurled it onto the trail between them. The bag burst on the wet rocks, splashing the thick, foul-smelling liquid across the narrow path. Then, he unhooked his own lantern, swung it back, and threw it with all his might into the pool of oil. The lantern shattered. The flame met the oil. The world erupted in a wall of greasy, orange fire. The flames shot up with a roar, licking at the stone walls, instantly filling the canyon with thick, choking smoke. Shadow reared back, his eyes wide with animal terror, his whinny a scream of protest. Eli fought the reins, his voice a low, calming growl in the horse's ear, forcing the panicked animal under control. They were trapped. The fire blocked the path ahead, and the narrow canyon walls made retreat a slow and dangerous proposition. The henchmen didn't wait to see the result. They turned and fled, their running footsteps echoing as they disappeared deeper into the canyon. Eli's mind worked with lightning speed. He scanned the canyon walls, his eyes cutting through the smoke and flickering firelight. To their left, the rock face was sheer and wet, but to their right, about 6 feet up, was a narrow ledge. barely a foot wide, that ran along the wall, bypassing the worst of the flames. It was too high and narrow to get the horse onto, but not a person. He didn't explain. He didn't have time. He spurred Shadow forward, forcing the reluctant horse to sidle precariously close to the wall of fire. The heat was intense, a physical blow. "The ledge!" he yelled over the roar of the flames. "Get ready!" He stood in the stirrups, bringing them level with the rocky shelf, in one powerful, fluid motion. He wrapped his arm around Nora's waist, lifted her clean out of the saddle, and deposited her on the narrow ledge. It was not a graceful or gentle maneuver. It was a desperate, life-saving act of pure strength. Nora landed with a jolt, her boots finding purchase on the gritty stone. For a dizzying second, she teetered, the fiery drop just inches away. Then she flattened herself against the cold, damp rock of the canyon wall. Her heart was a wild drum against her ribs. She was still clutching the lantern. The flame was guttering, starving for air in the smoky confines of the canyon. Without thinking, she clamped it under her arm, her shawl and the thick wool of her dress protecting the glass, creating a small pocket of still air. The flame steadied, a tiny, pulsing point of light, a frantic heartbeat in the chaos. Below her, Eli had already wheeled Shadow around and was confronting the one man who hadn't been fast enough to escape. The man had hesitated, looking back at the fire, and that hesitation had cost him. Eli leaped from the saddle, his movement a blur of dark motion. He hit the man with the full force of his body, and the two of them went down onto the slick stones with a grunt and a splash. It was not a fistfight. It was a swift, brutal takedown. Eli was on top in an instant, a knee pressed into the man's back. He didn't reach for a weapon. He unbuckled one of his own reins from Shadow's bridle, and with a few quick, expert raps, he bound the man's hands behind his back. The henchman was neutralized, left trussed and gasping on the wet ground. The other two were long gone, swallowed by the darkness of the canyon. From her perch on the ledge, Nora saw something slide from the captured man's coat during the struggle. It was a small, leather-bound book. It landed near the edge of the fire, its pages ruffling in the hot draft. She knew, with a certainty that cut through her own fear, that she had to get it. She began to inch her way along the ledge, her back scraping against the rock, her eyes fixed on the book. The lantern, still clamped under her arm, cast a small, flickering circle of light at her feet, guiding her steps. The fire roared beside her, its heat blistering. The shadows it cast were monstrous, leaping and dancing on the opposite wall like demons. The night itself seemed to be breathing in ragged, fiery gasps. She reached the spot directly above the book, knelt down on the narrow ledge, a precarious, terrifying position, and stretched out her hand. Her fingers brushed the warm leather cover. She hooked a finger under the spine and pulled it up. It was heavier than she expected. She tucked it securely into a deep pocket of her dress and began to make her way back. Eli met her as she scrambled down from the end of the ledge, his hands catching her and steadying her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with smoke and exertion. She just nodded, her throat too tight for words. She pulled the book from her pocket and handed it to him. He took it, and in the sputtering, unreliable light of their one small lantern, he opened it. The page was filled with a neat, clerk-like script. It was a ledger. There were dates, names, or rather, initials and sums of money. And next to each entry, a notation lamp service. At the bottom of the page, pressed into the paper with an official-looking stamp, was a familiar, ornate seal, a stylized D, surrounded by a circle. It was Darrow's company seal. This was it. This was the proof. The money trail, recorded in black and white. A gust of wind swirled down the canyon, and the fire below them roared with new life. The flames licking at the very edge of the trail. The smoke was getting thicker. They couldn't stay. Eli grabbed their prisoner, hauling the man to his feet. They made their way out of the canyon, half dragging the captured henchman between them. the fire at their backs. The darkness ahead was still absolute. The storm lantern in Nora's hand began to flicker and dim. The oil almost gone. Its light pulsed, faltered, pulsed again. A weak and fading heartbeat. Just as the flame gave one last, pathetic sputter and died, plunging them into the cold, complete dark of the pre-dawn hour, they stumbled out of the canyon's mouth. Before them, the sky to the east was no longer black, but a bruised, soft purple. A thin, pale line of gray was just beginning to define the horizon. The dawn was coming. They had made it through the night. The church was not a large building, but on Sunday mornings, it felt like the center of the world. It was the only time the disparate souls of Black Willow gathered under one roof, their work-worn hands clasped in prayer, their voices joined in song. But this Sunday was different. The air was not filled with the usual quiet piety. It was thick with a tense, expectant silence. The sermon had been unusually brief, the final hymn sung with a nervous energy. Now, the pews had become a gallery, the congregation an audience. Reverend Miller, looking deeply uncomfortable with the proceedings, had ceded the pulpit to Judge Alistair Moran. The judge was a circuit judge, a man who rode a wide territory and brought the weight of territorial law with him wherever he went. He was a stern, unsmiling man with a hawk-like nose and eyes that seemed to see right through flimsy excuses. He was, above all, a man of procedure. He set up a simple folding table in front of the altar, turning the house of God into a makeshift courtroom. The cross on the wall behind him seemed to be weighing the evidence along with him. "This is an informal hearing," Judge Moran announced, his voice a dry rasp that carried to the back of the church. "Called at the request of Miss Nora Vale to present a grievance. Mr. Lyle Darrow is present to respond. Let us proceed with civility and order." He picked up a wooden gavel and struck the table once. The sharp crack echoed in the vaulted ceiling, and a final, collective shuffle from the pews subsided into absolute quiet. Nora stood before the table. She had dressed with care in her best Sunday dress, a simple, dark blue wool that made her look resolute and serious. Her hair was pulled back tightly, not a single stray strand escaping. Beside her stood Eli, his presence a quiet bastion of support. He wore clean denim and had traded his dusty trail hat for a respectful silence. He was not a church-going man, and his presence alone was a statement. On the other side of the table stood Lyle Darrow, flanked by his lawyer, a slick-looking man from Cheyenne. Darrow looked perfectly at ease, almost bored, a faint, condescending smirk playing on his lips. "Miss Vale," the judge said, his eyes on her. "You have the floor." Nora took a steadying breath. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 100 times during the long, sleepless hours before dawn. She did not speak. Instead, she stepped forward and placed the small, leather-bound ledger on the table. The book, captured in the dark of the canyon, lay there between them, a silent, damning witness. "This is a payment ledger, Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. "It was recovered from one of Mr. Darrow's employees." She opened it to a marked page. It details payments made for what is described as lamp service. The payments coincide with the nights the town's street lamps were malfunctioning. The judge picked up the book, his bushy eyebrows furrowed in concentration as he examined the neat columns of figures. A low murmur rippled through the pews. People leaned forward, straining to see. Eli then stepped forward. He placed his own evidence on the table, setting each piece down with deliberate care: the hooked metal wick puller, the small, oil-soaked canvas bag. The objects looked incongruous and sinister in the hallowed space, tools of darkness laid bare in the morning light. "These were found hidden under the Ash Fork Bridge," Eli said, his voice a low, even baritone. "The bag contains the same heavy coal oil that was used to start a fire in the library during the community reading night." He looked directly at Darrow. "The same oil stored in Mr. Darrow's warehouse." Darrow's lawyer immediately spoke up. "Objection, Your Honor. This is pure speculation, a collection of misplaced items. There is no proof connecting my client to any of this." Darrow, however, held up a hand, silencing his own counsel. He leaned forward, placing his manicured hands on the table. He looked at the items, then at Nora, his smirk widening into a confident smile. "There's no need for objections," he said, his voice smooth and reasonable, the voice of a man accustomed to being believed. "The judge is a man of facts, and I am happy to provide them." He straightened up, his gaze sweeping over the faces in the congregation, making eye contact, projecting an image of wronged innocence. "The oil is, of course, mine. I own the only warehouse in town that stores it. The ledger, too, is from my office. I recognize the seal. It's used for petty cash disbursements." He paused, letting his admission of ownership settle in the room. He was hiding in plain sight. "But," he continued, his voice taking on a tone of magnanimous patience, "I can assure you that I did not authorize any of these payments, and I certainly did not employ anyone to put out lamps or terrorize the good people of Black Willow. It seems I have a thief in my employ, a rogue element." He shook his head, a perfect pantomime of disappointment. "As for these men, I don't recognize them. I have dozens of men on my payroll, miners, teamsters, warehouse hands. It's impossible to keep track of them all. If one of them has committed a crime, he should be punished, but it has nothing to do with me." It was a masterful performance. He admitted the undeniable facts, the oil, the ledger, but divorced himself from any responsibility. He painted himself as a victim, a busy, important man betrayed by a dishonest underling. "You say you do not recognize the man," Judge Morin said, his voice flat. "Sheriff, bring him in." The town sheriff, a man who generally tried to stay on Darrow's good side, shuffled reluctantly to the church's side door and opened it. Eli's prisoner from the canyon, a man named Cole, was led in. His hands were now bound in front of him with rope. He was unshaven, his eyes were bloodshot, and he flinched at the sight of the assembled crowd, his gaze darting around like a trapped animal looking for an escape. The judge fixed the man with a stony glare. "Son, is this man here?" He gestured to Darrow. "Your employer." Cole's mouth opened, but no words came out. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. His terrified eyes flickered toward Darrow. Darrow gave him a look not of anger, but of cold, final warning. It was a look that promised consequences far worse than anything the judge could mete out. The prisoner's gaze immediately dropped to the floor. He stared intently at his own feet, at the worn, muddy toes of his work boots. And in that moment, everyone saw it. Even in the dim light of the church, the evidence was caked onto his boots, the fine, black grit of coal dust, mixed with the mud of the canyon, the same dust that marked the trail from the library to the warehouse. The man didn't have to say a word. His silence, his downcast eyes, his dirty boots, they were a confession. Judge Morin saw it too. He looked from the boots to Darrow's impassive face, then back to the evidence on the table. His expression was unreadable, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "There are conflicting accounts here," the judge said finally, his voice carefully neutral, "and serious accusations have been made." He was not ready to challenge Darrow directly, not without more than circumstantial evidence and the silent testimony of a terrified man. "I will need time to verify the contents of this ledger and to question this prisoner properly. I am hereby ordering a full accounting of the inventory at the Riverside warehouse, to be conducted by the sheriff. Until that audit is complete, the warehouse is sealed. No one enters, and nothing leaves." It was a partial victory, a small but significant blow to Darrow's authority. The town would have 2 days of reprieve, 2 days for the truth to find its footing. Darrow's smile didn't falter, but his eyes had grown cold, the amiable mask slipping just enough to reveal the chilling emptiness behind it. The hearing was over. Judge Morin struck his gavel. This proceeding is adjourned. As people began to stand, shuffling out of the pews and whispering amongst themselves, Darrow did not leave. He waited until Nora turned from the table, and then he moved to intercept her. He stood directly in her path, forcing her to stop. He leaned in close, his voice a low, venomous whisper meant only for her. "Troi toi mayam dam noi lonve sao." "You speak so loudly," he murmured, the scent of his cologne cloying and invasive, "for someone who has to face the night." The threat was unmistakable, a silken promise of retribution. Nora froze, the color draining from her face. Before she could react, Eli moved. It was not a large movement. He simply took half a step forward, placing himself slightly in front of her, a silent, solid shield. He did not look at Darrow. He did not reach for the pistol holstered at his hip. He simply stood there, a quiet, immovable object. And in that hushed, tense moment, he spoke, his voice low and calm, but carrying the weight of an unbreakable vow. "Ko ai kong mot min." She's not alone. The words, simple as they were, changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. They were a declaration. Darrow's eyes flickered to Eli, and for the first time, his confident smirk wavered. He saw something in Eli's steady gaze that gave him pause. He held the look for a beat longer. Then, with a small, contemptuous sniff, he turned on his heel and strode out of the church, his lawyer trailing in his wake. Nora let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her eyes met Eli's. In the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, they just looked at each other. Her gaze was filled with a profound, unspoken gratitude that went deeper than words. His was steady, reassuring, a promise that he meant what he said. The look held for a beat longer than a normal glance, a silent acknowledgement of the trust and the bond that had been forged between them in fire and darkness. It was a look that lasted longer than a single heartbeat. That night, the town of Black Willow was quiet. The moon was a slender, silver crescent, offering little light. In her small room at the back of the library, Nora Vale prepared for sleep. She filled the basin with cool water. She brushed out her long hair. She changed into her simple cotton nightgown. And then she did something she had not done in 10 years. She walked over to the small lamp on her bedside table, the lamp that had been her guardian for a third of her life, and she blew it out. The room plunged into a soft, gentle darkness, and she was not afraid. But she did one other thing before she got into bed. She walked to the door that connected her quarters to the main library, and she did not bolt it. She did not even close it all the way. She left it cracked open just an inch, a silent invitation. She was no longer waiting for the darkness to come for her. She was waiting for the sound of 3 quiet knocks. The 2 days granted by Judge Morin passed in a strange, suspended quiet. The town held its breath. Darrow's warehouse remained sealed, a silent monument to the temporary shift in power. For the first time in a long time, the street lamps burned steadily through the night, their light a quiet promise that the town was watching, waiting. The wind, however, was changing. The crisp, dry air of late autumn was being pushed out by a heavy, humid breeze from the south, carrying the scent of distant rain and the metallic tang of an approaching storm. Eli had spent the better part of the afternoon at the library. The splintered door frame, a violent reminder of the attack, needed more than a simple repair. He worked with a quiet, focused competence, measuring, sawing, and fitting a new, stronger piece of oak into place. Nora moved around him, dusting shelves and organizing books, the familiar, peaceful rhythm of her work, a counterpoint to the steady rasp of his saw and the clean, sharp taps of his hammer. They worked in a comfortable silence, the space between them filled not with words, but with the quiet language of shared purpose. As the sky outside bruised to a deep, moody purple, Nora looked up from her work. "That storm will be here soon," she said, her voice soft. "You shouldn't be caught out on the range in it. The roof in the back storeroom still has a small leak from the last one. You could stay and fix it, if you'd like." The invitation hung in the air, simple and practical, yet carrying a weight far beyond a simple repair job. He stopped his work, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He looked at her, then at the darkening sky. "I'd like that," he said. The rain started just as he was putting his tools away, not with a gentle patter, but as a sudden, torrential downpour, as if a bucket had been upended in the heavens. It hammered on the tin roof, a deafening, chaotic drumming. A moment later, the sky was split by a jagged, brilliant fork of lightning, and an instantaneous, deafening crack of thunder shook the very foundations of the small building. The oil lamp on the main desk, its flame a steady, golden beacon in the growing gloom, leaped and sputtered violently. Its light danced and shivered, throwing wild, distorted shadows across the walls. Nora, who had been on her way up the small stepladder to retrieve a book from a high shelf, froze. Her foot was on the second rung, her hand outstretched, but she was no longer in the library. The sudden, violent clap of thunder was the groan of mountain timbers. The frantic, jumping flame of the lamp was the last, dying sputter of her father's lantern. The hammering rain was the sound of rock, of earth, of 1,000 tons of mountain cascading down, sealing the tunnel, sealing her in. She stood utterly still, a statue carved from memory. Her breath caught in her throat, a painful, sharp knot. The color drained from her face, leaving it as pale as parchment. She was 17 again, and the world was ending. Eli saw it happen. He saw the life and the quiet purpose drain out of her, replaced by a stark, absolute terror. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, seeing a darkness that was not in the room. He put down his hammer, the sound a dull thud on the wooden floor. He did not rush to her. He did not call her name. He moved toward her slowly, his steps quiet and deliberate, a calm, steady presence moving through the storm of her past. He stopped beside the stepladder. He didn't touch her shoulder or her arm. He reached out and gently, lightly, placed his fingers over the back of her hand where it rested, trembling, on the wooden frame. His touch was not a restraint. It was a question, an anchor. "Nora," he said, his voice so low it was almost lost in the drumming of the rain. "Let me try something." For a long moment, she didn't respond. He could feel the fine, violent tremor in her hand, the frantic, trapped bird flutter of her pulse against his fingertips. Then, she blinked. Once. Twice. Her eyes slowly came back into focus, finding his in the flickering, unsteady light. He saw the terror there, but he also saw a glimmer of trust. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a tiny gesture that was an act of immense courage. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the kind one takes before plunging into icy water. Eli kept his hand over hers for another second, a silent promise. Then he let go, walked to the desk, and picked up the oil lamp. He held it up between them. The flame danced, casting their faces in a moving, dramatic relief. He brought it closer to his own face, and then, with a soft, steady breath, he blew. The flame vanished. The room was plunged into darkness. It was not the violent, suffocating blackness of the mine, nor the chaotic, smoke-filled blackness of the attack. It was a soft, gentle darkness, filled with the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the roof and the faint, clean smell of the wet earth outside. Eli's voice came out of the quiet gloom, calm and steady, a guide in an unseen world. "1," he began, his voice a low, soothing cadence. 2, 3. He didn't stop there. "Listen," he said. "Don't try to see, just listen. Can you hear the rain? It's a different sound on the tin roof than it is on the window panes. Hear that a steady drumming and a soft patter." Nora stood frozen on the ladder, her knuckles white where she gripped the frame. She was breathing in tiny, shallow gasps. "Now listen for something else," he continued, his voice unwavering. "The old wood of this building. It's breathing. It creaks when the wind hits it. There. Did you hear that? That's the sound of a safe, dry house settling in a storm. He paused. I can hear my own breathing. I can hear yours. It's a little fast. Let's slow it down together. He took a slow, audible breath in, and then let it out. Breathe with me. Nora's eyes were squeezed shut, in the darkness behind her eyelids. The images of the mine were trying to form. The splintered timbers, the wall of rock, the smell of dust, the terrible, final silence. She could feel the phantom weight of the mountain pressing down. The drip of water in the canyon echoed in her memory, a terrifying precursor to collapse. But Eli's voice was a rope, pulling her back from the edge. It was real. It was here. It was now. The rain on the roof, the creak of the wood, the sound of his breathing. She focused on the sounds he was describing, letting them fill her mind, leaving less and less room for the ghosts of the past. She took a breath, shaky and uncertain at first, and then another, a little deeper, trying to match his rhythm. The memory came, a cold wave washing over her. But for the first time, it did not pull her under. It was a ghost story being told in a safe room, its power diminished by the steady, living presence of the man speaking in the dark. She slowly, tentatively, took her hand off the stepladder. She reached out into the darkness, her arm outstretched, her fingers searching for something solid, something real in the present moment. Eli did not grab her hand. He had been standing close, and he simply raised his own, placing it just beneath hers, palm up, an offering. The choice was hers. Her trembling fingers brushed against his. The calloused, warm reality of his skin was a shock, a sudden, powerful affirmation of life. She slowly, hesitantly, curled her fingers around his, her hand finding its place in his larger, stronger one. It was not a desperate grip. It was a quiet, voluntary connection. A long, shuddering sigh escaped her lips. It was the sound of a weight being set down, a burden she had carried alone for 10 long years. The trembling in her body did not stop all at once, but it slowly, gradually subsided, like the last ripples in a quiet pond. She turned her head in the darkness, toward the sound of his breathing. A small, watery smile touched her lips, a smile he could not see, but one he could surely feel in the gentle pressure of her hand. "Hem kong so nua," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "When you're here. I'm not afraid anymore. Not when you're here." They stood like that for a long time, hand in hand in the gentle, rain-filled dark, saying nothing more. There was nothing more that needed to be said. Finally, Eli gently squeezed her hand and then let it go. She heard the soft scrape of a matchstick, and a moment later, a small, sulphurous flare of light bloomed in the darkness. He relit the lamp. The warm, steady light returned, pushing the shadows back into the corners. The room was just as it had been before. The rain still streamed down the windows. The thunder still rumbled, though more distantly now. But everything had changed. Nora had come down from the ladder. She stood on the solid floor, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. Eli stood by the desk, the lamp casting a warm glow on his face. Their eyes met across the room. A slow, quiet smile spread across his face, and she returned it with one of her own. It was not a smile of triumph or passion. It was a smile of deep, quiet understanding, of a shared vulnerability that had forged a new and profound intimacy between them. In the warm, golden light of the lamp, surrounded by the storm, they shared a soft, knowing laugh, the gentle, comfortable sound of two adults who understood the power of restraint, and the quiet, unshakable strength of a hand held in the dark. The day of the judge's decision dawned gray and uncertain. A nervous energy hummed through Black Willow, a current of anticipation that was almost a physical presence. People went about their chores with a distracted air, their eyes constantly drifting toward the church, where Judge Morin was reviewing the evidence with the sheriff. By late afternoon, the verdict was in. The judge had rendered his decision behind closed doors, and the official announcement was scheduled for the following morning. The waiting, the not knowing, was a unique form of torture. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, a familiar, creeping anxiety started to return to the town. Doors were bolted a little earlier. Curtains were drawn a little tighter. The victory of Sunday morning felt fragile, a brief respite before an unknown darkness returned. But this time, one person refused to let the fear take hold. Hazel, her face set in a look of grim determination, wiped down her bar at the rusty spur, slammed the rag onto the counter, and walked out into the street. She didn't have a plan, not a fully formed one, but she had an unshakable conviction. She walked to the general store, then the blacksmith's, then the baker's. She knocked on doors. Her message was simple, a call to arms armed not with guns, but with glass and tin and burning wicks. "He wants us to be afraid of the dark," she said, her voice a low, fierce growl. To anyone who would listen, "He's counting on us to scurry back into our holes and wait for his judgment. I say, to hell with that. I say we show him what this town's light looks like. All of it. Together." Slowly, an idea took shape, passed from neighbor to neighbor in hushed tones, a spark catching on dry tinder. It was not a protest. It was not a mob. It was to be a parade of lights. As full darkness fell, a single point of light emerged from the door of the saloon. It was Hazel, holding her big brass lamp aloft like a torch. A moment later, a door opened across the street, and the blacksmith and his wife appeared, their own heavy-duty lanterns swinging between them. Then another light appeared, and another. From every home, every business, they came. They gathered in the main square, a silent, luminous assembly. There were old, soot-stained railroad lanterns, clean-chimneyed house lamps, and small, tin-punched lanterns carried by children. It was a motley, beautiful collection of every flame in Black Willow. Nora had spent the last hour working with the children who had come to the library seeking reassurance, using thin paper and strips of willow wood. She had helped them fashion simple, beautiful paper lanterns, each with a small, protected candle inside. Now, these children walked at the front of the procession, their creations bobbing in the dark like captured stars, their faces illuminated with a solemn, innocent pride. Behind them walked their parents, and behind them, the rest of the town. The old ranchers, their faces creased like worn leather, walked with a slow, steady gait, their wives' shawls pulled tight around their shoulders. No one spoke much. The only sounds were the soft shuffle of dozens of boots in the dirt and the gentle, metallic creak of lantern handles. It was a river of light flowing through the heart of the town. On the edge of the procession, a dark shape moved in parallel. Eli, mounted on Shadow, rode a slow, steady patrol. He was a silent, watchful shepherd for this flock of lights. He did not look at the parade. His eyes were constantly moving, scanning the dark rooftops, the deep shadows of the alleys, the black, empty windows of Darrow's warehouse. He was a part of their defiance, but his role was different. They were the light. He was the guardian of the flame. They walked the entire length of the main street, a slow, deliberate reclamation of their town. They were not marching on anyone. They were simply walking, their combined light a testament to their shared resolve. As they neared the far end of town and prepared to turn back, 3 figures emerged from the deep shadow of an alleyway ahead of them. It was the 2 remaining thugs from the canyon, along with another of Darrow's men. They stood in the middle of the street, blocking the path. One of them was holding a bucket. With a sneering laugh, he swung it, and a dark liquid sloshed across the road in front of the parade, the foul, familiar scent of coal oil instantly fouling the clean night air. The man then pulled a match from his pocket and struck it, intending to create a wall of fire, a line of terror they would not dare to cross. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The front ranks of the parade faltered, the children shrinking back behind their parents. But this time, there was no panic. There was no scream. Before the man could drop the match, Hazel's voice boomed through the night. "Hold the line! Turn your backs!" Instinctively, as one, the people in the front of the parade did as she said. They turned, presenting their backs to the threat, their bodies forming a living wall. They held their lanterns close, shielding the precious flames from the wind and the men. It was a profound, instinctive act of nonviolent defiance. They would not engage. They would not run. They would simply protect their light. The man with the match hesitated, confused by their reaction. In that moment of hesitation, Eli moved. He spurred Shadow forward, not in a charge, but in a swift, powerful advance. The big horse, a dark and imposing force, closed the distance in a few powerful strides, stopping directly in front of the three men. Eli didn't draw his weapon. He simply sat there, a silent, immovable object, his hand resting casually on his saddle horn. His message was clear: you will not pass. The thugs, faced with a wall of determined townspeople on one side and the cold, unwavering presence of Eli Rourke on the other, lost their nerve. The man dropped the unlit match, and with a final, impotent curse, the three of them turned and melted back into the darkness of the alley. A great collective sigh of relief went through the crowd, and then a cheer started. It was small at first, then it grew, a wave of sound rolling through the river of light. They had faced the darkness, and they had not blinked. It was into this scene of quiet triumph that Judge Morin appeared. He had heard the commotion from the sheriff's office and had come to investigate. He stood at the edge of the crowd, his stern face unreadable in the flickering lamplight, and took in the sight of the entire town, united, holding their lights against the night. He held up a hand for silence. The cheering slowly subsided. "I was going to wait until morning," the judge said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "But it seems this is the more appropriate venue." He unrolled a piece of paper. "I have reviewed the evidence. The payment ledger provided by Miss Vale has been authenticated. The tool marks on the damaged street lamps are consistent with the wick puller found by Mr. Rourke, and the chemical analysis of the residue on the canvas bag matches precisely the unique composition of the coal oil stored in Mr. Darrow's warehouse." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Lyle Darrow has been found responsible for conspiring to deliberately endanger the public, for the destruction of private property, and for extortion. He has been assessed the maximum fine allowed by territorial law. He will also pay, in full, for the repair of the library and for the reinstallation of every street lamp in this town. His business license to operate within this territory is hereby suspended, pending a full federal review." The verdict was absolute. A stunned silence held for a moment, and then the square erupted. It was a roar of pure, unadulterated joy and relief. People were clapping each other on the back, hugging their neighbors, laughing. The long night was finally over. In the joyful chaos, Nora stood near the steps of her library, a small, quiet smile on her face. A new, hand-painted sign now hung beside the repaired door. In neat, clear letters, it read, "The Black Willow Library, open after sunset." The next few days were a blur of activity. Under the sheriff's supervision, a work crew, paid for by Darrow's fine, began the process of repairing and reinstalling the street lamps. The hated protection fee was a thing of the past. The cloud of fear that had hung over the town for so long had finally lifted, burned away by the light of 100 lanterns. That evening, as the first of the newly repaired lamps was lit in the square, Eli found Nora on the library steps. The air was cool and clean. He stood before her for a moment, not saying anything. Then, he reached into his pocket and held something out to her on the palm of his hand. It was a small, rectangular object made of brushed steel, a flint and wheel lighter. It was a simple, practical thing, but beautifully made, with a satisfying, solid weight to it. "Eli, I can't," she started. "It's not a gift," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's a tool. Every person should have a way to make their own light." He closed her fingers around it. The metal was cool against her skin. "Listen to me, Nora, you're strong. You proved that, but you don't have to be alone in the dark ever again." He looked at her, his gaze direct and filled with a deep, abiding respect. "If you ever need it, if you're ever afraid, you call me first. I'll come, no matter what." He paused, and a small, rare smile touched his lips. "But light this yourself first." It was the most important thing he had ever said to her. He was not offering to be her permanent protector. He was affirming her own strength, promising to be her partner. He would stand with her, but he would not stand for her. Nora looked down at the lighter in her hand, then back up at him. She didn't say thank you. The words were too small for the magnitude of the moment. Instead, her thumb found the small, serrated wheel. She took a breath, and with a flick of her thumb, she struck it. A shower of sparks flew, and a single and brilliant blue flame bloomed in the twilight, bright and clean and utterly fearless. At that exact moment, the lamplighter across the square lit the main street lamp, and its gaslight hissed to life with a warm, golden glow. A cheer went up from the small crowd that had gathered to watch. They were cheering for the lamp, for the return of light to their town, but for Nora and Eli. Standing on the library steps, the cheer felt like it was for them, for the small, brave flame cupped in her hand. The night was falling, deep and dark and star-dusted, but for the first time in a very long time, for the people of Black Willow, it was not a thing to be feared. The dawn that broke over Black Willow was a quiet absolution. It arrived not with a sudden, dramatic flourish, but as a slow, seeping tide of pale, rose-tinged light. The great storm had passed, leaving the world scoured clean. On the tin roof of the library, the last of the rainwater gathered in heavy, silver drops, and then let go, falling with a soft, rhythmic plink, plink, plink into the rain barrel below. The sound was not the frantic drumming of the storm, but a gentle, meditative ticking, the sound of a clock resetting itself. From the small living quarters at the back of the library, a thin ribbon of smoke curled from the stovepipe, carrying on the clean, cool air, the rich, life-affirming aroma of freshly brewed coffee. The town woke up to a new kind of silence. It was not the tense, watchful silence of the past weeks, but a deep, peaceful quiet. The first tangible sign of this new era came not with a proclamation, but with the mundane rumble of wagon wheels, a single, unadorned black carriage, its curtains drawn, was seen leaving town on the eastern road before most people had even finished their breakfast. There was no fanfare, no farewell. Lyle Darrow was gone. He had paid his fine, settled his affairs with the judge's clerk under the steely gaze of the sheriff, and had vanished as quietly as a snake slithering back into the rocks. He left behind a legacy of fear, but it was a legacy that was already beginning to crumble, like a weathered monument in a forgotten graveyard. A week later, his warehouse and all its contents were put up for public auction. The townspeople gathered, not with the grim determination of their parade of lights, but with a cautious, hopeful curiosity. The blacksmith and the owner of the general store pooled their resources, and with a small loan from a few of the more prosperous ranchers, they bought the building and its contents. It was to become a community cooperative, a place to store grain and supplies, owned by the town, for the town, the first brick in Black Willow's foundation that was not owned by a single, powerful man had been laid. Inside the library, Nora sat at her desk, the morning light streaming in through the clean window panes. In front of her lay the thick, leather-bound ledger, her own ledger, the one that chronicled the small, honest transactions of her life. She took her pen, dipped it in the inkwell, and drew a single, clean, black line through the fraudulent charge for night protection services. The act was a small one, but it felt momentous, an exorcism of a paper ghost. With the reduction in her lease, a condition of the judge's ruling, and the small but steady income from the new evening reading classes for the town's adults, the numbers finally added up. The library was no longer a precarious, unprofitable venture hanging on by a thread. It was viable. It would survive. It would remain. A steady, rhythmic sound came from the front of the room. Tap, tap, tap. It was the sound of Eli's hammer. He was finishing his work, securing the last corner of the new window frame he had built to replace the one damaged in the storm. He had refused any payment, simply stating that a town's library ought to be a secure place. Each tap of the hammer was a clean, declarative sound. A nail driving deep into solid oak. A final, percussive statement that this place, this sanctuary, was now whole and strong again. Nora walked over, a steaming mug of coffee in her hand. She watched him for a moment. He worked with an unhurried, efficient grace, his movements precise and certain. The smell of fresh sawdust filled the air, a clean, wholesome scent that mingled with the aroma of coffee and old books. When he had driven the last nail, he tested the frame with the flat of his hand, making sure it was solid, that it did not move. She reached out and placed her own hand on the frame. Next to his, the wood was smooth and strong under her palm, still warm from the friction of his tools. It was a small, ordinary window frame, but to her, it was a symbol of everything that had changed. It was a bastion against the storm, a testament to resilience, a quiet promise of safety built by a quiet man. She looked at his hands, at the calluses and the strong, capable fingers that could be so firm and yet so gentle. Her eyes, to her surprise, began to brim with a thin, bright film of tears. They were not tears of sadness or of fear, but of a profound, overwhelming gratitude that was too large to be held inside. Eli finished his coffee, the silence between them comfortable and deep. He set the empty mug down on the windowsill. The morning was warming up, and it was time for him to head out to the ranch. He turned to her, his gaze soft in the morning light. "Toi ne ko thap den kong?" he asked, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "Will you light a lamp tonight?" The question was not about illumination. It was about everything that had passed between them. It was about the mine, and the storm, and the darkness, and the fear. Nora looked up at him, and a slow, genuine smile spread across her face. A smile that reached her tear-bright eyes and made them shine. "Ko," she said, her voice clear and sure. "Nung kong pai vi so." "Yes, but not because I'm afraid." They walked to the porch, into the cool morning air. He was about to turn and leave, to swing up onto his horse and ride away into the business of the day, but he hesitated. He turned back to her, and in the quiet space under the small overhang of the library's porch, he raised his hand, not to hold her, but to gently cup the side of her face. He leaned in, and for a moment, he simply rested his forehead against hers. It was an act of incredible intimacy, a silent sharing of thoughts, of trust, of a peace that had been hard-won. Then, he leaned back just enough to close the small space between them. The kiss was not the desperate, passionate kiss of a storybook romance. It was warm, and it was brief. It tasted of coffee and the clean morning air. It was a kiss of quiet understanding, of shared labor and mutual respect. It was not a fairy tale ending. It was a promise of more mornings just like this one. It was enough. Just as he stepped back, the bell in the church steeple began to ring, its clear iron tones marking the 8th hour. From the livery down the street, a horse gave a cheerful whinny, eager for its breakfast. The town of Black Willow was awake, alive, and bathed in the thin, hopeful pink light of a new day. Eli swung up onto Shadow's back, gave her one last, small nod, and rode off down the street, a solitary, self-sufficient man who had chosen not to be alone. Nora stood on the steps and watched him go. The steel lighter he had given her a comforting, solid weight in her pocket. Darkness would still come to Black Willow, as it always did. The sun would set, the moon would rise, and the vast, empty spaces of the prairie would be swallowed by the night. But from now on, for Nora Vale, the darkness was no longer an enemy. It was no longer a tomb. It was simply the quiet, peaceful space where two people could breathe, side by side. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd really like to support the channel, hitting that hype button helps this story reach more listeners just like you.